Welcome in, everyone. This is the Dominator. I'm Josh Larky. Let's talk some Week 7 fantasy football starts and sits. I'll get right down to it. At quarterback, we are going to start Sam Darnold. He's the consensus quarterback 8 this week in the Fantasy Pros consensus rankings. He faces the Lions at home. Now, there's no Aiden Hutchinson rest of season for the Lions. And this is really, really important. The Lions were already bottom 10 in quarterback pressure rate as a defense. What kept them respectable was that they had a decent sack rate because Aiden Hutchinson had a league-leading 7.5 sacks in only 5 games played. He was pacing for more than 25 sacks on the season. The rest of the team combined for just 7.5 sacks. Hutchinson had half of them. Darnold's going to have a lot of time to throw in what was already an above-average matchup before the only marquee player on that defense, Hutchinson, was out for the season. Darnold's coming off the Week 6 bye. It's just the perfect storm for Darnold. Now, stream. We're going to stream Drake Maye, the consensus quarterback 16 this week at the Jaguars. Now, last week in his NFL debut as a starter, he had 243 passing yards, threw 3 touchdowns, only had 2 interceptions. But more importantly is that what we saw at North Carolina translated to the NFL. He ran 11 times per game at North Carolina, and last week he ran 5 times for 38 yards. So we did get some of that rushing upside. If you're getting a few fantasy points a week from rushing, we'll take that. The Jaguars, just in general, are the best matchup for fantasy quarterbacks. I mentioned them last week where I said Caleb Williams must start. He throws 4 touchdowns against them. I know Drake Maye isn't Caleb Williams in terms of supporting cast, but I think you can get 16 to 20 fantasy points from him in London this week. We'll actually talk about that game more later on. And I've got a pick for Underdog Fantasy entry for you. 2 highers, 2 lowers. Running back position. I didn't like him last week. He ended up not playing. So we'll call that a push, I guess. But this week, I really like Brian Robinson. He's the consensus running back 17 versus the Panthers. So first off, the Commanders have the highest implied team total of the week in the betting markets. 29.5 points. That's insane. Vegas bettors are essentially expecting around 4 touchdowns from this Commanders offense. We like touchdown upside for fantasy points. Just in general, they're more than touchdown favorites against the Panthers. That sounds like a pretty good game script for someone like Brian Robinson to me. I dig into the stats, and then I go, oh, wow. The Panthers have allowed 2 rushing touchdowns per game this year to running backs, most in the NFL. 6 running backs have topped 70 rushing yards against them. Brian Robinson, when we look at the wins, where he doesn't leave the game early due to injury, he's averaging 20 touches per game. I think he's going to get a lot of work, and I like the matchup. Brian Robinson, welcome back to our fantasy lineups. Another one is Chase Brown. We're going to start him running back 20 at the Browns. I got this wrong last week. I thought it was going to be a little more of a committee. Oh no, they're phasing Zach Moss out. Chase Brown nearly lost a costly fumble that could have lost them the game against the Giants last week. This was towards the end of the game. He loses a fumble. Didn't matter. The team goes right back to him. He's the one that busted the 30-yard touchdown run to ice the game. That was Chase Brown. The Bengals are touchdown favorites. Great game script to run the ball. The Browns have allowed 4.5 yards per carry, 93 rushing yards per game to the position. And then if we look at Underdog Fantasy Pick'ems, you can see that Chase Brown's total yards prop is a very healthy 73.5 yards. He's expected to have a pretty good game this week. Last one, we're going to dig deep. There's a sneaky, we'll call this the sneaky running back start of the week. It's going to be Jaguars' D'Ernest Johnson. He's the consensus running back 44 against the Patriots. Now, I think very surprisingly, D'Ernest Johnson outsnapped Tank Bigsby 34-16 last week. 34-16. Doubled him up in snaps. This is a game where Travis Etienne got hurt early. And I mentioned with Drake Maye that I talk about this game more There is massive home field advantage in London for the Jaguars this week. The Jaguars were in London last week. I know they got embarrassed by the Bears, but it's okay because there's no time difference for them this week. The Jaguars are in London just this entire week, just relaxing, getting used to the time change they had last week. Meanwhile, the Patriots have to fly across the pond. They're going to be a little bit more tired. And that's just kind of the game script that we're going to want for these Jaguars running backs. Bigsby only out-carried Dearness Johnson 7-6 last week in the loss. This is a sneaky flex play, a desperation RB2 if you need it, in Dearness Johnson. Turning to the wide receiver position, we are going to start Jordan Addison. Consensus wide receiver 25 versus the Lions. You thought I wasn't going to mention a Vikings pass catcher when I lead the show off with Sammy Darnold. You were wrong. So Detroit was already a top 10 matchup for receivers, regardless if they were on the outside or lining up in the slot. They lost, as I mentioned, to Aiden Hutchinson for the season, the broken leg. Jordan Addison had 2 touchdowns and 79 yards in week 4. Then week 5, he faced the Jets. He only caught 3 passes for 36 yards, but it's an elite secondary. He still had 8 targets in that game. Then he had the week 6 bye. Addison's just a glaring start this week. I think people forgot about him because he had that tough week 5 Jets matchup, then the bye. So we haven't really thought about Addison as scoring fantasy points for 2 straight weeks now. And I think that's all about to change. Next guy. Folks, we talk about him every week. Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Consensus wide receiver 27 at the Falcons. The most matchup-specific, matchup-dependent player in all of fantasy, potentially. We are starting him at the Falcons. Atlanta's a top 8 slot matchup. You know what to do, folks. When it's a great slot matchup, I'll let you know. We fire up JSN. And if it's a bad one, I'll let you know. We sit JSN. Geno Smith is averaging a league-high 42 pass attempts per game. That's number 1 in the NFL. I think we're going to get 7 to 9 JSN targets this week. I think we get that top 20 PPR fantasy finish. We're also starting Wan'Dale Robinson. I was very shocked to see him all the way down at the consensus wide receiver 37 versus the Eagles. The Eagles are the second best matchup for slot receivers this year. Wan'Dale himself is getting 10 targets and more than 6 receptions per game. It's crazy. It's crazy. We're going to start him once again in PPR formats as a fringe top 24 option. I think if anything, Malik Neighbors' impending return is neutral or helps Wan'Dale Robinson overall. A little less defensive attention on him. There's enough to go around in this Giants offense. And the last receiver to start, it's gross. Hold your nose. Hold your nose. Now, that was actually live on air for anyone not watching the YouTube. I'm embarrassed for that moment. We're starting Jerry Jeudy. He's the consensus wide receiver 46 versus the Bengals. Now, the Bengals have generally clamped down on the slot position this year, but they struggle against outside receivers. More than 85% of Jerry Jeudy's yardage this year has not come in the slot. It's actually come on the outside, which is where the Bengals have been struggling. And now there's no Amari Cooper. Remember the Buffalo Bills traded for Amari Cooper? I think Jerry Jeudy's getting force-fed targets in a game where the Browns are touchdown underdogs. It's going to happen for him. And then at tight end, it's going to happen for teammate David Njoku. Consensus tight end 10 versus the Bengals. So David Njoku's averaging 3 catches, 30 yards per game on the season. He hasn't scored. We don't like that. But like Jeudy, he's going to get benefit from no Amari Cooper. I think he's going to see 7 to 12 targets this week. Top 5 option for me at the position. It's just hard to find that kind of bankable volume at tight end. And if we harken back to last season, the second half of last year, David Njoku was actually the fantasy tight end 1. Finally, stream, but before we hit you with those fantasy sits, before we hit you with that underdog pick for entry with 2 highers, 2 lowers, this is the deepest of the deep dives. If I told you we're going to stream the tight end 24 by consensus rankings, you'd call me crazy. You could call him Grant Calcaterra. We are going to stream. Oh my, I don't know what the hell that segue was. We're going to stream Grant Calcaterra, tight end 24 at the New York Giants. Some of you out there don't know what team he plays for. We'll keep it going. We'll give it just a few more seconds. If you're listening at home, you're listening in the car, just think, Grant Calcaterra. Give you a hint. Dallas Goedert is going to miss week 7 with injury. Calcaterra is on the Eagles. He's actually at over 2 yards per route run on the season. That's elite. He's ran over 60 routes this year. We have an actual sample for Grant Calcaterra. He had 4 catches, 67 receiving yards last week when Dallas Goedert went down. We've got the condensed target tree where it's basically A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, and then Grant Calcaterra. It's a solid matchup against the New York Giants for tight ends as well.
Hey, I know it's a popular statistic to cite, these underdog pick'ems, the vast majority of people go more than on any given player. Yeah, close to 80% of people, but that's because it's easier to find the shootouts than it is to find the dud games every Sunday afternoon. Like we knew week 5, Ravens-Bengals was going to be a shootout. And there goes Lamar Jackson for 4 touchdowns. There goes Joe Burrow for 5 touchdowns. Derrick Henry gets there. Zay Flowers is over 100 yards. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both got there, as well as Chase Brown. Both Chases got there. You go more than. You 100x your payout on Underdog with their Pick 6 contest. But then you look at Dolphins Patriots, that's going down the toilet, right? Too bad Ramondre Stevenson at 18 fantasy points. But you improve your chances at positive returns when you correlate with these Underdog pick'ems. Use promo code Underworld. This is the biggest bonus Underdog has ever given out, up to $125. Promo code is Underworld. Put in $250, you get $125. Now go start picking.
Welcome back, folks. I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator. We went through my fantasy starts of the week. Let's talk about some fantasy sits. Then we hit you with that Underdog Pick'em entry. And I've got my phone up right now because I did make a correlated London entry. And I'm just going to give the folks this entry. Then we'll hit some sits. Then I'll give you my start sit matchup based higher lowers. So I took this. It ended up being, $25 in, potentially just over $500 out. Now I talked about this London game. I really like the fact that the Jaguars are going to have this big home field advantage. They've been there, as I mentioned. This is week 2 now of being there. And the Patriots on the other end, they just want to see what they have with Drake Maye. They're really just letting the young kid figure it out. On the Jaguar side, 3 hires for the fun game environment. Lawrence over 249.5 yards. You get the little spicy, the spicy pepper. Brian Thomas higher, 59.5 yards, another spicy pepper. Ingram higher, 45.5 yards. These are what I believe to be the target leaders most weeks. Thomas had a down week last week, but it was the Bears. Ingram looked great in his return. So it's basically Lawrence needs 250 or more. Brian Thomas needs 60 or more. Evan Ingram needs 46 or more. I think that can happen. Great home field advantage. The Patriots defense has just been up and down this year. And then on the Patriots side, Drake Maye, the alt line where you just click those up down arrows, select, and then you start scrolling higher than 229.5. So I think he can have a 230-yard day. He had 243 last week. And then Demario Douglas had 9 targets, 6 catches, 92 yards, and a touchdown last week. I think he can have a good day against a terrible secondary. Took him higher, 44.5. So you basically need 230 from Maye, 45 from Demario Douglas, 250 from Lawrence, 60 from Brian Thomas, 46 from Evan Ingram. And that if you put 25 in, you can get 500 back from that. That sounds quite nice. Some sits. This might be a little less nice sounding because I'm a little bit concerned about Kyler Murray this week. He's the consensus fantasy quarterback 12. He faces the Chargers. Kyler Murray, to his credit, has got 2 games over 25 fantasy points this year. The other 4 games were under 16 fantasy points. It's kind of this Jekyll and Hyde situation. Quarterbacks against the Chargers are averaging only 14 fantasy points per game. And Kyler Murray is going to be without Marvin Harrison Jr., who's concussed. It's just all shaping up for a down game from Kyler Murray, who's been kind of a disappointment this season. At the running back position, I am going to be sitting Bucky Irving this week. Let me take that morning coffee sip. Bucky Irving, the consensus running back 24 versus the Ravens. Running back rooms have averaged just 45 rushing yards per game against the Ravens. They're under 2.9 yards per carry for the season. Here's the big problem with Bucky Irving. Rashad White, if he's healthy, or Sean Tucker is going to be the pass catching back most likely. Irving himself has averaged 1.7 receptions and under 12 receiving yards per game this year. It's simply the wrong game for Bucky Irving to pop off in fantasy. The other one, I might look like an absolute donkey when this game ends, but I'm sitting Nick Chubb versus the Bengals. Consensus has him running back 29. It looks like he's returning this week. I really don't know how much work he's going to get in his first game back. It's a train wreck of an offense overall. Nick Chubb in the past has gotten there in fantasy from heavy rushing volume and touchdowns. The Browns have the third lowest team total in the betting markets. The bettors have an implied offensive total of 18 total points for the Browns. That's probably 2 touchdowns. They're the only, I don't want to butcher this stat. I saw this online. It was like something along the lines like the Browns are the only team in the past 20 years ever, something like that, to be under 20 points in their first 6 games of the season. And what's crazy is Deshaun Watson's actually had good matchups through these first 6 games. The schedule is about to get much tougher in another couple of weeks. It's crazy how bad the Browns have been, how bad Deshaun Watson has been. That's karma hitting you in the face. Anyway, Nick Chubb, let me get off my pedestal. No, we can do a Deshaun Watson rant another time about just how bad he's been. Anyway, I think Nick Chubb in his return, I don't know, 8 to 12 carries. What are we expecting? The guy shredded his knee for the second. He shredded that knee for the second time. He's 29 years old. I don't think he's going to be fantasy relevant in his first week back from the serious injury. I think there's just better options out there that are not Nick Chubb. I was shocked. I thought he'd be like RB 45 this week. Consensus is putting him into nearly RB2 territory first week back. Concerning. Receiver. George Pickens, sit. Wide receiver 30 by consensus versus the Jets. I faded him last week. He only had 3 catches against the Raiders. We're going to fade him again against a top 3 secondary. George Pickens, I looked at every single game he's played in his career dating back to college, to high school, to middle school, to Pop Warner, to Pee Wee football. He's never played a game with Russell Wilson before. Overall, that's such a stupid joke. He's never played with Russell Wilson before. They don't have familiarity with each other in NFL game action. Overall, Jets Steelers, second lowest game total on the week, just 38.5 implied points overall. There's just not much touchdown upside. I'm not buying it. Also going to sit Michael Pittman, the consensus wide receiver 38 versus the Dolphins. Anthony Richardson should return this week. Joe Flacco's averaged more than 10 pass attempts per game. Joe Flacco above what Richardson's been averaging. Josh Downs has been out targeting Pittman, who is playing through a back injury. Michael Pittman almost went on injured reserve, then he didn't. Pittman ultimately has been under 40 yards in 5 of 6 games this year. The touchdown last week and the week before that kind of conceal what he's actually doing. Like he had 3 catches, 35 yards last week. The Dolphins themselves are just a super rough matchup for receivers as well. Tight end. Sit Hunter Henry. Consensus tight end 13 at the Jaguars. Now I know I just talked about how I like that London game a lot. I do. But when we're looking at the tight end position, I think Hunter Henry's still a little bit of a thin play. He had 3 catches, 41 yards, and a touchdown in Drake Maye's first NFL start last week. That's great. But it was only a 15% target share. It's still not a great offense. And the Patriots have this extreme road disadvantage traveling to London when Jacksonville is going to play their second straight game there. If we're going to bet on Hunter Henry, this is probably not the week for it. We've got a couple questions in the chat. Someone's asking, 6-point pass touchdown, -3 interception. Anthony Richardson, Drake Maye, Jared Goff. 6-point passing touchdown. I'd lean Jared Goff for that one. Let's see what else. Yeah, we've got people in the chat. They are agreeing. I love when people check my work. Not everyone out there believes that George Pickens, dating back to Pee Wee football, has not played a game with Russell Wilson. They had to check themselves. They had to call up some high school, some middle school coaches, and they confirmed it. Folks, those are the start sits. Let's hit you with that Underdog Fantasy Pick 4 entry. I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator. Drake Maye. Higher, 202.5 passing yards. I gave you that alt line that I like for the London game earlier in the show. But if we're looking 50-50 type fantasy picks, 202.5 passing yards is so low. Drake Maye had 33 attempts, 243 passing yards against Houston last week. It's a prime matchup this week with the Jaguars. I think the Jaguars are going to put up a lot of points, as I've mentioned a few times against the Patriots. They're going to need to throw. It looks like Ramondre Stevenson will probably miss week 7. He didn't practice on Wednesday. And without your starting running back, you're going to have to pass more. He just needs 203 passing yards. It's a low number. We're also going to take, before we get to those two lowers, we're going to take Jordan Addison higher, 50.5 receiving yards. I've been hinting it's a great matchup against the Lions. He had 72 yards 2 games ago. Then last game, he had the 8 inefficient targets. I think he's going to have 6, 7, 8, 9 efficient targets this week. I think he has at least 51 receiving yards. Then we go Michael Pittman, lower, 49.5 receiving yards. As I mentioned earlier, it's going to be low pass volume with Anthony Richardson, who's averaging more than 10 pass attempts below Flacco this year. Tough matchup against the Dolphins. He's playing through the back injury, under 40 receiving yards in 5 of 6 games. Michael Pittman, lower, 49.5 receiving yards. Last one. This is the weirdest one out there. Chase Brown, lower than 2.5 receptions. Let's unpack this because I know. I just told you to start him and then took his lower. But it's because I think he's got a great day on the ground as the primary ball carrier. Quietly, the Cleveland Browns are allowing just 3.7 running back targets per game. That's one of the lowest marks in the league. Chase Brown himself has not had more than 3 targets in any of the 6 games. So already Chase Brown has not had more than 3 targets in any game, any of the 6. The Bengals are touchdown favorites. In the Bengals' 2 wins this year, Chase Brown's actually been under this number in both those games. So already we like that based on game script. It's a weird pick to take, but I think it hits. I thought Chase Brown was going to be listed at 1.5 receptions for a fantasy pick, not 2.5. So the fact that he's gotten 3 in a couple games, but almost every game, 67% of them, he's actually been below 2.5. And then the game script's on our side. It all works out. He's not trusted in pass protection. We're rolling with Chase Brown, lower 2.5 receptions. Michael Pittman, lower 49.5 receiving yards. Jordan Addison, higher 50.5 receiving yards, and Drake Maye, higher 2.5 passing yards. Folks, that's 17 starts and sits in 20 minutes. I ended up giving you 2 Underdog Fantasy entries out there. Promo code Underworld. I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator Week 7. I will see you all next week. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.